first, let's start off by talking about how fat cells actually grow.
Right. Well, look, fat is an actual term that elicits some pretty negative responses, right? I mean, if you think about it, uh, when you hear the word fat, it's in your mind, it automatically turns into something that's not so positive. Even if you walk in a grocery store and you walk by the butcher cabinet and you see the fat on the rind around the steak, like it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of gross, right? And the other experience that we all have associated with fat, and this is, I think, common to everyone, all of us take a shower in the morning, step out naked, and out of the corner of our eye, we see in a mirror a little lump or a bump that wasn't there before or we don't think belongs there. And you automatically think, man, I gotta do something about that. I gotta eat better. I gotta work out or whatever it is. Then you step on the scale, and that number doesn't deliver what you expect. It's a disappointment. So all around, this whole idea of fat, body fat, is kind of in our society become quite a negative thing. But I'm actually here to tell you that there's a completely different way, a more, I think, liberating way, more powerful way to look at fat. It has to do with biology because I'm a scientist. What scientists do is we are interested in looking at the origins of things. So where does fat come from, right? Like fat doesn't just automatically come up when we're adult and we want to actually lose some weight. Turns out what's amazing is that fat forms when we're in the womb. So when your mom's egg met your dad's sperm, ball of cells emerged. First tissue that got laid down were blood vessels because every future organ needs a circulation. Second, nerves started forming because every organ needs a channel to receive signals on what the organ should do. The third tissue is little bubbles of fat. They're called adipocytes, little fat cells, and they form like bubble wrap around every blood vessel. Now, the reason is fat cells are not actually bad. They're good. They're actually fuel tanks, just like the tank in your car, and they wrap themselves around blood vessels because when you eat food and you get energy, the energy comes through the blood and it gets stored into the fuel tank, right? So it makes a lot of sense. Now, that means that we had body fat before we had a face we could stuff with food. Very important to think about. I mean, mind-blowing to think about, really. Yeah. Now, when you're born, think about it. A cute baby. How do you know there's a cute, healthy baby? It's pudgy, it's chubby, it's fat, round, right? Big chubby cheeks, round tummy, arms and legs are like balloons, like that circus balloon you twist into a poodle, right? So fat babies are considered healthy babies. So fat's actually good at the moment we're born. And in fact, if you saw a baby that had chiseled cheekbones, thin arms, long, thin thighs, like a fashion model, you go like, well, there's something seriously wrong with this baby. And you'd be right. And that's the key thing. Fat is important in our origins. It starts before we were born. And so the real new science about fat and the new science about your metabolism tracks back into this origin. So the question is, what does fat do? Why do we even have it? And why is it important?
Yeah. Oh, man, it's so fascinating. I love this because we have to reframe something that has been so vilified in our culture, and in some aspects, rightfully so. But if we don't, oftentimes we're fighting against something we don't understand and also trying to hate our way into fitness. And so creating a new relationship and value and understanding with fat has been a big mission of mine as well. And yeah, and I know, again, having someone like you as an ally in this, because it really starts with education. And now we get into a place, so we know the beginning, the origins of fat and why it's so valuable. It's helped us to evolve as a species and not need to have like a funnel of food going in all the time because fat is there to do its job. Now let's talk about what happens when we become, quote, over fat, or fat cells begin to grow abnormally. How does that process work? How are fat cells growing in the first place? Does this have something to do with that first thing that develops, blood vessels?
Yeah, so let me kind of put a little story together first to talk about how fat helps us. And that's really the best way to start, I think, this conversation is, what is fat doing? Why do we need it? Why does it form so early? And it actually has completely to do with our metabolism, which is what my new book is really about. It's not a diet book. It's really a metabolism book, and it's really the new science of the metabolism. So to break it down and to understand why excess fat is so damaging to our health and compromises our fitness, let's reel it back just a little bit to say, okay, how does normal fat? First of all, what does normal fat do? Normal fat, first I mentioned to you, is a fuel tank. It literally is a canister, a jerry can, to be able to store fuel that we eat. Just like if you had a car and you're driving around, you need your engine to run smoothly on gasoline. What do? You look at the fuel gauge. When your fuel gauge runs low, runs towards empty, you pull over to the filling station, pull out the nozzle, plug it into the car, and press the handle, and you actually fill up the tank. When the tank is filled, there's a click, and that's it, and you put it back, and you drive off with a full tank, right? So our body is kind of like a car engine. That's how our metabolism works, how it actually gets energy. And so the engine of our body needs fuel the same way as a car. Now, when our fuel gauge, which we sense in our brain, runs low, all right, what do? We don't go to the filling station. We pull over to the dinner table, to the restaurant, to the refrigerator, the pantry, right? That's how we actually pull over. And we put we load up on fuel. Our fuel is food, all right? That's our energy. Some people call it calories. I don't want people to get distracted on the whole topic of calories because this becomes such a fixation. But we just call it calories, but let's call it fuel. And so what happens is that when we eat, the fuel goes into our body, and our body produces a hormone called insulin. Insulin is a hormone that basically says, "Oh, you got some fuel? You're eating? Let's pull that energy into our function, so we have enough fuel, just like you would when you're filling up a car. And then anything extra that you don't need at that moment to keep running your body, your engine, it gets stored away." And it's smart that we're storing it away, because when we're not eating, we need to draw down from it, right? It's our storage. So where does it store it? It stores it in body fat. So what does it do? It takes those the food that we eat, goes into our stomach, absorbed into our bloodstream. That energy, the fuel, actually is stored with insulin's help into little fat cells. Those little fat cells with a bubble wrap that form when we were in our mom's womb. Okay, and it just stores up. It's loaded up. Okay, it's our fuel tanks. Now, when we actually are not eating, when our insulin goes down, our body normally can draw down from that extra fuel, and it reaches for the fuel tanks. It just empties it out. Normal fat cells are not big. They're tiny. And when you load them up, they get a little bit bigger. It's like a water balloon that you fill up halfway, and then you stop. You can just squirt that water. You can draw it out from that water. But what happens when you overeat, it's like going to the filling station, and imagine if you were pumping gas and that clicker didn't stop the gas from flowing when your tank is full. Imagine what would happen, right? Gas keeps on pumping up. Gas tank fills up, but now it continues to overflow. Gas comes out of the side, runs down the side, around the tires, around your shoes, and now you are standing in this dangerous, flammable mess. Now, in our bodies, when we're fueling up, we don't have the clicker to stop us from eating. So we can keep on eating, all right? And we can overload and overfill our tanks. In our body, it doesn't run down around our shoes. What happens, our body has to pack it away in fat. So those little fat cells get bigger and bigger and bigger. They get stretched to their max, all right? And if you keep on eating and you still got more fuel, guess what? The body's got to make more fuel tanks. Now you take stem cells and you make another fuel tank, another fat cell, and that gets filled up, and you still got more fat, got to make another one. Keep on cloning it. And that's why overeating, overloading our bodies with fuel, that habit that too many people practice. I mean, it's a kind of a hallmark of modern society, and lots of other complexities, right? There's a psychological component. There's all kinds of marketing forces that can actually make us do this. Overloads our body, and so then the fat actually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, what's the connection to blood vessels? Well, fat is an actual organ in the body, and it means it needs a blood supply. So, and I'll tell you why it's an organ in a second, but it needs a blood supply. And so when fat starts to clone itself because you need more fuel tanks because you got too much fuel, and it keeps on getting bigger and bigger and fat, and it starts to fill up more and more. The faster it grows, the more blood supply it needs. But if it can't grow its own blood supply quickly enough, what happens is that in this giant expanding mass, the center of that mass is starved of oxygen. It starts to die. It's called hypoxia, not enough oxygen. All right. And when that happens, the fat becomes inflamed. Inflammatory cells infiltrate that fat. And we see this even in cancers that are trying to expand. They can't grow enough of a blood supply, it starts to die in the middle. Once you have inflammation and hypoxia inside a mass of fat, you completely derail your metabolism. And you derail many other hormonal systems as well, and it sets you up for harm. So, the answer to your question, what happens and why does it happen and what's the connection to blood vessels? That's a simple way to think about the fact that when we eat, we're loading up our fuel. When we overeat, we have to keep on loading it up, and it's going to create more fat. When that fat grows too big, it's going to start to die in the middle of the mass. Can't grow enough blood supply. It starts to kind of go bad, hypoxic, and that starts the trigger to all kinds of problems downstream.
This is fascinating. So again, this is something we see experientially on the surface, but to understand what's happening with our fat cells. So number one, they're getting filled up with content, right? And so they're expanding their volume. And our fat cells can actually expand their volume hundreds of times their size. But at a point, they're going to start to replicate as well. So that's talking about the stem cells, which we'll get more into in this episode for sure. And so now we're making copies, but all of these blood vessels, so we've got the filling up of content, but with the blood vessels, they also need to create more blood vessels, angiogenesis.
That's right.
So they can get a fuel supply, an oxygen supply, nutrient supply, so that they can keep growing in the first place.
Exactly.